There you go. Okay, so our first speaker is Evelina Judeikyte. I hope I didn't butcher your name. Yeah, so Evelina works in data analytics. She specializes in data viz design. You might have seen some of her work on Twitter. I know I have. Evelina is active in the data visualization community. She writes for Nightingale and co-hosts the Data Viz Paris Meetup. And she also helps organize the Outlier Conference, which is part of the Data Visualization Society. And she spoke at Data Viz Tbilisi, which is pretty cool. So here we are now. Evelina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. Just a quick sound and video check. I know we have to ask if people can see and hear us in these Zoom meetings before we say anything interesting. Okay, thanks for that. You can also see my screen, right? Let me just get set up. Okay. Gonna go into full screen. So hi everyone, as it's been so nicely introduced, my name's Evelina and I'm very excited to be joining you today for several reasons. One of them is the fact that I love interacting with data visualization practitioners all over the world. And the other one is that I'm originally from Lithuania, so we sort of consider our Nordic neighbors as kind of at least half neighbors on the other side of the sea. And when I was studying for my bachelor's, I actually lived in south of Sweden for a few months, so it always brings nice memories. So thanks again for having me. As Tyler said in the introduction today, I do data analytics and visualization for a startup here in Paris, and I also consult and teach on the side. But as many people in the data visualization community, I definitely did not study such a thing called data visualization. I don't have a master's in data visualization. I did business, economics, and then finance. And for a long time, I had a job in sort of data analytics, but on the financial side. And I used to create data visualization all the time, I think at least once per week for Excel and PowerPoint presentations. But at the time, I had no idea that such a thing as visual perception and data visualization best practices existed. So I just created pretty much the defaults that Excel let me create with 100 categories and colors in a stacked bar chart. And then a few years into that job, I started learning how to code. So I was coding in Python, and that's where this whole new world of data visualization opened up to me. I learned that data visualization can be lots of fun. It can look good, that there are some visual best practices that you can manipulate in a good way, of course, to share insights with your users and all sorts of stuff like that. What happened here? Okay, so starting there, things sort of unraveled. So that was a few years ago, and I got infected with the data visualization bug. And I think I can proudly or sadly say today that I live and breathe data visualization. I think every single day I see graphs and charts all the time, and I talk about them all the time. My boyfriend would definitely concur. And at some point when I started creating data visualizations, especially a bit of a complex ones, I realized that I spent a lot of time sort of lost in the process. So the decisions I were making sometimes were not, I wasn't making them at the right time, and I felt like I was wasting time. So if we were in a physical meeting, I would say raise your hand if, so you can just use a chat for that. So raise your hand in the chat if you've spent 10 hours just picking a color right off the bat when you start working on a visualization, and then only to realize 2 days later that the chart type you have chosen or the audience is not going to work, or that the audience is something different than you had expected. So all those kind of decisions work better when they're organized. So this is something I worked on last summer when I was contacted by researchers at Ashton University. They asked me to contribute a chapter to a book on data visualization. So I did my research and wrote up a a process for data visualization design. So of course I had to make a visualization on the process, obviously. It's the one you see on the screen. And this is what we're going to talk about today using an example. We'll start in a second. But before we do, I just want to add a quick note here. And even though my talk is titled Data Visualization Design Process, and that's how I'll talk about it, I don't pretend to have found some magic way of doing things, or that it always looks the same way for every single project and every single person. It will depend on the way you do things, on the type of project and your audience. It will also depend on the time you have. So what we're doing today is looking at sort of all of the best practices and tips gathered from experts in the field who've been doing this for far longer than I have, and also borrowing a few ideas, as you'll see, from other fields like UX design and journalism and even rhetoric. Okay, so let's dive right in. In order to illustrate all of these concepts, we're going to look at an example, a visualization that I created recently. This one was created for the Data Visualization Society's 2020 census. So maybe you're familiar with it already. If not, especially those who are attending the meetup for the first time today. So there's this such thing as Data Visualization Society with at least tens of thousands of members all over the world. And once per year, there's a survey that you can opt to participate in which you're asked, let's say maybe 50 questions or something, maybe a bit less, about how long it's been that you've been practicing data visualization, what kind of tool you use, how did you learn, and many more questions like that. So this is the visualization I created for this challenge. I'll add a note on it as well that it's technically a competition. So when you submit an entry, there will be like a jury panel looking at it. I'm just mentioning it because it will matter in terms of the way we define the audience. So we'll look at a few steps of how I created this. Okay, there you go. So as I showed in the visual that I created for the book, we are looking at 3 steps. So explore, arrange, and style, and then deliver. In case you come from a design background, you may have heard of this define, develop, deliver kind of approach. I think there's a 4th verb in there, but I can't remember what that is. So this is a similar way of describing it. It's sort of tweaked and a bit influenced by the art of rhetoric. So the ancient Greeks who lived literally thousands of years ago, people like Aristotle and Cicero, and helped us define lots of stuff, including some things that I use for data visualization. And the very first one, the exploration stage, is the one in which we define what our audience is, who our audience is rather, and what there is to say about the data. So we're not creating visualizations for the purpose of showing them, at least per se. The way we're going to look at all of these steps, I'm not going to give you an extensive list of this is what could be helpful for you in each step. I'll rather point you to more resources at the end in case you're interested in the topic. And for today, I'd like to focus on the whys and the hows rather of each step. So as I said, in the exploration stage, we're gonna talk about the audience and find the focus or the insights in the data. I strongly believe that before we dive into any data set or try to visualize or sketch or do anything else, it's important to do our research about the audience. It can be maybe a big thing to do that will take us hours or days if it's a huge project and we don't know the audience. It can just be 30 seconds if you're visualizing things for a company you work for and you know the people, but it's still important to take at least a second to just down and say, okay, for this project, these will be the people looking at it. So I've come up with a few questions that can help you define who the audience is. So we're looking at who they are in the broader sense possible. So the more information you can gather, the better it is. What they care about so that you can focus your visualizations on it. And the third part of it is how familiar they are. So both with the topic that you're working on and data visualization in general. Now, if we look at the example of the visualization that I showed you at the beginning, as we've discussed, the audience for this project were mainly data visualization practitioners, so be it beginners or experts already in the field. And the ones who will be looking at the graphic that I created, they care about creating good data visualizations. They also care about learning and getting inspired from the data visualization community. So when I was analyzing the audience, I decided that they're pretty much all familiar with the topic, at least a little bit, and know how to read and decipher at least the simplest chart types, but most likely complex visualizations as well. So this is one way of doing it. You can also split it into user personas, which is a term you will hear in UX research and UX design. So I could have also said that there's this person called Evelina, and she's a beginner in the field, and she's looking to learn from other data visualization practitioners. And then the second person is Tyler, and he's already an expert, and he's just looking to upgrade his knowledge by looking at the best visualizations out there. So this will help you sort of have a note somewhere in case you're struggling with one decision or another during your process. You don't need to write it down like I did here. It can be just maybe a tiny post-it that you stick on your laptop while you're working on it, just so that it's somewhere in the back of your head. And you know, when you're choosing the colors and all those trivial details, you come back to it. And remember that the audience is the most important thing in your project. So once we're done with the audience profile, we usually start to dig into the data. And you'll notice that in this process, I'm skipping the entire this entire idea of gathering the data and cleaning it, looking at the metrics, transforming it, pivoting it, melting it, whatever you need to do. I intentionally decided to do that because if you work for a company, then more often than not, the data will be imposed on you. If you're working on a personal project, then I'd say you gather your data after step number 1. So after profiling the audience, that you've thought about the audience first before you decide what you're going to show. The finding the focus part, or finding the insights, the patterns in the data, can be messy and a little bit confusing, especially if the data set is unknown to you. Some researchers have called this the investigative phase, or the detective's work, when you're just given a bunch of numbers and you're trying to find something in there. I find that the journalistic approach really helps here. So the 5 W's that you see on the screen, depending on the project, you may just use 2 or 3. That's what happens to me the most, but they can all be very helpful. So the way I use this most of the time is that I would first sort of do an aggregate round of 5 W's. So what I mean by that is I would do it at the entire data sets level. So when I was looking at the survey from the Data Visualization Society, I first answered the what. So there was a very long list actually for the what's of the tools, the learning methods, the frustrations, everything there was, the who in a general sense, the data that was collected at the end of 2020 all around the world, etc. And then whilst I'm going through this first round of 5 W's, there will be something that will pique my interest, and usually I will dive deeper and do maybe another 2 or 3 rounds of the same analysis. When I was looking at this data, one of the first questions that sort of grabbed my attention was about learning data visualization. I think it was phrased as, how did you learn data visualization? And there were 3 options. One was totally self-taught, the other one was at least partly self-taught, and the third one was mainly formal courses. And as someone who is also a self-taught data visualization designer, I get really curious and decided to only use the subset of the data, including the people who said that they were completely or partly self-taught. in the data visualization field. And then I sort of dug deeper and decided to keep just the few of the what's in there. So that's how I go about it. But that's not the only thing that can be helpful when you're trying to find the insights in the data. So sticking with journalism, I think writing down a headline can also be very helpful. So let's admit it can also be very hard, but it acts as a sort of through line, if I were to borrow a word from theater, for the entire graphic that you're creating. So be it a standalone graph or an infographic or a 5-page dashboard. So think of a headline as a message that you want your audience to take home with them, or virtually home with them, at least in today's context. So it should be short, not too specific, but something that will pique their interest. There are a few examples here that could have worked for the visualization that I created. So the goal is to use maybe 2 or 3 of the 5 W's, so the what's and the who's that you came up with, and try to aggregate them into one sentence that will guide you through the rest of your work. So when later on, when you're deciding what to keep and what to remove in terms of content, it can be really helpful to say, okay, so my headline is this is what I want the audience to remember. Does this graph or does this annotation reinforce my point, or is it completely outside of it? So that's how you can look at this. Okay, so now we know who our audience is. We found all sorts of insights that we want to show, and we can start visualizing things. And at this stage, I don't dive right into a visualization tool either. You can see on the screen that there are 2 other steps that I normally go through before I do that. And once again, it really depends on the project and can sort of go back and forth, but let's just, for the sake of the exercise, look at them in order. So the very first one is looking for inspiration. It was Austin Kleon, and if you haven't heard of him, you definitely should check him out. It's Kleon with a K, so okay, I'll write it down in the chat later. So Austin Kleon wrote in his book, "Steal Like an Artist," that all good artists steal, or at least something in those lines, which means that every original idea that we have, or we think we have, has been inspired by at least, I don't know, 5 or 10 other things that we've seen around. And I see that this definitely works for data visualization as well. So I wrote down a few examples of websites, places I go to for inspiration, depending on what I'm working on. And here are a few people or organizations that I also follow on at least a weekly basis. And I'm sure there will be a way to share the slides with you guys, so don't worry about making screenshots or writing them down. So what I really like about looking for inspiration is that it gives me ideas, not necessarily on an exact visualization that I need to make, but on the way people use different encoding. So most of the time I will just borrow a tiny idea. It can be, oh, I'm going to place a legend in here, or add an annotation this way. I do like looking at complete visualizations, but I know that many other designers, they also just look at sort of not vague, but abstract pictures that evoke the emotion they're looking for, that give them the vibe of the visualization they're working on. So whichever way you choose to do it, whatever works for you and your project, the idea afterwards is to create a sort of mood board. So once again, this is a term and a concept borrowed from design. This is more or less how it looked for the project I was working on. So as you can see, there's very different stuff, from trying to make 3D bubbles to complete charts in terms of layout. Another side note on looking for inspiration, I love doing it all the time, not only when I'm working on a project, but also outside of it and saving them in somewhere. So for me, it's Pinterest. As you can see in the screenshot, there's an intruder in there, which is the home yoga space folder. So just ignore that. I just moved to a new house, so I'm working on that too. So for me, it's Pinterest. I have different folders in there, and I save images that I see all over the internet. It can be just a folder in the bookmarks bar of your navigator. It can also be a folder on your desktop, whatever you feel most comfortable with. The reason I sort of insist of it is that it's been so helpful for me in the past couple of years, because so many times when I have to create a visualization and I'm maybe hesitant about the chart type or the layout that I need, at least half of the time I will remember some visualization that I saw a while ago that solves at least a tiny part of my issue. So I would just go back to it because I had saved it somewhere, and it would be very, very helpful. So once you're done with the inspiration, you go into the sketching phase. Most of the time we hear and we talk about sketching as in sketching with pen and paper. I know some people like to prototype, as they call it, or sketch directly with code. That's not the way I do it, as you can see in the screenshots here, but just because I really like the feeling of pen and paper, but whichever works for you. The sketching part of the design process is something that comes up nearly all the time whenever you talk to experienced data visualization designers. I think there are numerous benefits to it. One is the fact that you're more creative, at least pen and paper, because you're not constricted to the tool that you're using. So you can draw anything, and then whether you know how to code it or how to make that in tableaus is another question that will come later. It also forces you to be maybe a bit more minimalistic than you would be on a computer. So say if I create a line chart in some whichever tool, most likely it will add grid lines and all sorts of values on the axes all over the place, even though I didn't ask it to. But if I draw on paper, then I have to draw each line, and most likely I will be lazy, I won't do it, which is a better data design decision. So as you can see from the random pictures on the screen, the little ones were the very first sketches that I made in a train in a tiny notebook that I had with me, and the bigger one is sort of the final sketch that I created when I had a pretty clear idea of what I wanted to do. So we're done with sketching, and we can finally get into the tools themselves. So of course, the tools will depend on your background, on your project, and on your experience. Most of the time, at least for me, if I'm not just making a simple bar chart but something more complex, this step is the most disappointing one. And what I mean by that is that we'll sketch something and it will look awesome on paper and be like, oh, this is what I'm going to create. This project is going to be really cool. And then I create it in my tool and it just looks like nothing I had imagined, and I'm all sad. So to lessen the disappointment and to make the process the most effective possible, at least for me, I divide this third part of working in a software in a few little bits. So the first one would be creating all of the visual elements I will need. So it can be the title, the subtitle, the data source, all the annotations, the legends, the one chart or the several charts, everything that I will need, not worrying about where they're put on the screen so far. Creating everything in black and white, just everything I'll need, I put them somewhere. And then once I'm done with that, I decide on the layout grid that I will need. I'm not going to get into the details of the grid, but I would say never work without a grid. And even myself, I heard about a layout grid for the first time, I think maybe a year ago. So it's definitely a concept to be explored. We can talk about it more afterwards during the Q&A. So once I have my grid, I will place all of the elements that I had created on it. So for this visualization, it's a bit of a complex modular grid, maybe overly so, just because I had the bubbles and circles all over the place. Most of the time, I would just work with a simple 12-column grid, rather, like I showed in what happened in this example. So I just create everything, put it on the grid, and that's when I decide if I need color, if I need any highlighters, if anything in my data needs to pop out. So this is the moment at which I added the highlighters, that you can see the difference between this one and this one, because I wanted to highlight the preferred learning methods as the metric that I was showing, and also highlight the top 3. So I definitely didn't do it right from the beginning. I did nearly at the end, and as you can see, I also stuck with just black and white because I didn't. I'll show you a few screenshots later, but I didn't manage to make any other colors work better than black and white, so I just kept that one. A quick side note: this is Austin Kleon, his full name spelled correctly. Even though, as I said at the beginning, we're discussing this process as something very neat and nice and just flows from the beginning to the end, in reality, most of the time, it's definitely not like that. I know personally that I spend quite a lot of time in the little dot that says Dark Night of the Soul in nearly all of my projects. And by the end of it, you sort of manage to make it work and you're kind of happy and proud with it. Let me show you an example. So you saw the last visual that I created. These were the first few versions of it. So at first I wanted to work with something where I didn't need to code for it to be quicker. So I tried to create the circles, the packed circles in raw graphs and Flourish, but I didn't like the way it looked because the bigger bubbles, and the size of them is the years of experience in the field, by the way, the bigger bubbles, they were gathered in the middle. And since at first I had this crazy idea of using shadows to make the bubbles look like as if they were 3D, as you can see by the end of the project, I totally abandoned the idea. So when I was trying to do that, as you can see on the right, all of those circles, they looked like I was trying to hypnotize people, and it definitely didn't work for me. So I tried all sorts of different colors because I had this idea of 3D bubbles, but I had to just get rid of it in order to make the visualization work. And if I'm completely honest, I almost gave up on it 3 times because it wasn't like a client project. It was just a personal thing I wanted to do. I was like, okay, this is not working. I'm just going to leave it be. And then I would keep coming back to it, and I ended up creating the circles in D3, even though D3 is, my knowledge in D3 is quite limited. So it's a bit of a struggle, and Tyler can probably tell us a bit more about that. So I ended up creating it in D3, and you saw the final result. So one last question in this process of working in a software that I ask myself is there anything else that I could remove? The quote that you see at the top in green, that good design is as little design as possible. This is something I go by all the time, and I think it shows in the work that I create. I think more often than not, we should ask ourselves if there's anything else that is not really adding value to our visualization, rather than asking ourselves how we could make it more fun or more colorful. So there we go. We've explored the data and the audience. We've created what we wanted to create, and now it has come the time where you're going to show the data to other people, because that's how I call this step. I strongly believe that it's important to gather at least one person's feedback before you publish it. So be it send it to your stakeholders, to your client, or publish it online. For my personal projects, it's usually just my boyfriend, who's very nice, but he gives it to me straight. If he doesn't get it, he's just gonna tell me that this makes no sense and that it's ugly. So at least I can count on that. So we need to find someone who will tell you the truth, maybe gently, but at least will give it to you straight. These are a few questions that I find helpful, so that the feedback session doesn't go as, oh, I don't like this, or why, I don't know, or I would rather see green than blue, that kind of thing, because that's not very helpful, constructive feedback to you. What you're looking for is to know where your users' eyes are drawn, what kind of message they're taking out of it, is there anything that is unclear, that kind of thing. So post feedback, you may need to iterate a bit more, maybe not, but probably at least a little bit. I've included a few other design ideas that I tried for the final visual that I showed you earlier. The only one that I sort of considered was the one with the yellow highlighters. I kind of liked something about it, but I couldn't figure out why I didn't like it completely. So I just stayed with the black and white one. What I find really helps is just putting all of the ideas you have pop up into your head next to each other. So don't delete or replace anything, just create a copy and then put them next to each other, and you'll see really quickly which ones you like and which ones you don't. So once you're done with that, you can go ahead and publish your project. So I say publish here, but as a last step of the process, it's not necessarily going to be the very last thing, because maybe you're publishing on the web and you're gonna gather some user data and see what's working and what's not, which may lead you to more modifications after all. But let's say this is the publication of your very first draft. So this is how I would go about it. I hope this is helpful to you guys. I know for a long time I didn't seem to find any resources on the topic. I've included 2 books that could help you. I think Andy Kirk is sort of famous, the one on the right, in the data visualization community. The book on the left was written by Finnish researchers at a university, and I only discovered it a few months ago, and I really recommend it. It's a really nice book. There's sort of a side benefit for us design people that it's designed really nicely, which is really rare for books, because usually the writers, even though they're designers, they don't really have their word to say about it. But this one is really, really nice and clean. So as I said, you can download all of this stuff, the visualization and a sort of cheat sheet of everything that I said today, with the questions and the summary on my website. So this is how they look like. And in case you want to practice it, I gave a workshop on it at DataFest in December. So it's a 1.5 hour session where I actually stop and discuss every concept in more detail. And there are little breaks during which you can practice on your own. And there's a sample data set that you can work with. So this is the link. I'll share the slides with you guys so that you don't need to memorize this crazy link, or you can just go to DataFest Tbilisi on YouTube and find me there. So that's it from me for tonight. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them now, or you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn, where I just have my normal name, or Twitter, which shows on the screen. I'll be happy to chat with you about your design processes and the struggles and the joys that you face.
Great. Thank you very much. That was a really great walkthrough. It was very in-depth, which is good. We have our first question. By the way, I know I mentioned before, but if you have any questions, definitely put them in the chat. So first question, when in the process did you refer back to the audience description? Do you have an example of how it helped?
I think one of the most, at least the first one that comes to mind, is when I make decisions on the kind of encodings that I'm going to use. So, when you have to choose the right chart type, often am I going to use a line, the bar, or if you're making something a bit more complex where you want to maybe have a bar and a circle around it, I think it's important to circle back to the audience and ask yourself again, okay, the people that I'm showing this to, are they going to understand it? Do I need to show them something that they, for instance, in business context, will need to be able to comprehend in 5 seconds? Or do I have 10 minutes and then I can do something different? That's one example.
Yeah, the work you do, is it like a mix of kind of business cases and more creative stuff, or does it tend to lean in one direction more than the other?
So as I said at the beginning, I work for a startup. So at work, it's mostly business kind of stuff. My daily battle is to make it more design friendly and user friendly and friendly for the eye. So I'm working on that. And then when I work on side projects, so I often participate in challenges for nonprofits. And I also do some consulting work when I have the time. So those are more creative, more static, where I will maybe do D3 and then some designer software so that I can add all sorts of annotations that business intelligence tools don't let me add at work.
I can definitely appreciate that. When I was freelancing, I would do those kind of competitions on the side. And I remember I'd like pour my heart and soul into these designs, and I would lose every time. I was like, these people don't know what good data viz is. But I realize there is a lot to be said about the audience, to your point. It's really a pretty central part of the process. Someone asked if you've read Edward Tufte's The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. I guess if you recommend it, or
I haven't yet. It's like people keep recommending it, and it's on my list. I believe that Edward Tufte has just published a new book as well, if I'm not mistaken. So it's like all over my social media feed. So I definitely need to do that. It's not really easy to get, especially this one and the other one of the first ones, because like on the usual book ordering websites, they're not as easily available as the other ones, unfortunately.
Yeah, all of these books, just for everyone's benefit, they're generally best in print rather than in getting a digital copy, so you can really open it up and kind of see how it really looks. And also, of course, the designers, when they make the books, they're making them with the intention of it being seen in print, which that has a big impact on the presentation. Do you feel that the process is applicable to exploratory data viz? For example, when you don't have a clear message, or you're just kind of showing a larger data set?
You may adapt the process a little bit, but I do think it still applies, because even if it's an exploratory data visualization, you're not going to show everything, or at least I hope you're not. As you were saying at the very beginning about your new data visualization challenge, that there were years and years of weather data in Sweden, and you're most likely going to pick a subset, or at least an angle. Andy Kirk, in the book that I showed you in one of my screenshots, he calls it the editorial angle. So you will still want to think about it at least a little bit. Maybe it will be for a specific department at work if you work in a company, or just a subtopic. It may cover most of the data, but you still need to ask yourself those questions of, because your audience is going to explore the data, but you're going to probably want to direct them somewhere so that they arrive at a certain conclusion, maybe 5 conclusions, depending on where they click. They sort of a decision tree or something like that. So I would say it still applies, maybe a modified version of it.
Absolutely. So next question, how do you navigate the data viz technologies? There's so many tools to learn, the list, D3, JavaScript in general, React, R, Python, etc., let alone design and statistics. As an autodidactic, how did you prioritize and efficiently learn these alone? So I guess go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very good and overwhelming question, I would say. It's probably for every designer, it's a bit of a struggle on a daily basis. So I come from an analytics background, and I do my data transformation and analytics in Python if I have the choice, maybe sometimes in Tableau. So I don't really need to work on that part, because as I said, I have a master's in financial economics, so the statistical principles are sort of okay with me. The side that I need to work on and want to work on is the design side for me. So that's what I've been doing in the past year. I would say maybe like 20 hours a week or something. So all of the different tools, the concepts, and also because I find it enjoyable. But in terms of data visualization tools per se, it does feel like if you want to be relevant, you kind of need to know all of them. So I'm even myself a little bit confused in the field, and I would be curious to hear what everyone else have to say. So I feel that you need to know a bit of everything, unless you're super specialized, like if you're Natty Bramer and you can do stuff in D3 that no one else can do, or like Shirley Wu, and then you're a D3 specialist and you don't need to go into other tools. If you do a mix of consulting and business analytics and also static work, then you need to mix up different tools. Just to end on that, personally, I think today I can sort of do a bit of everything, D3 and JavaScript being at the bottom of the list, because I only started a couple of months ago with Tyler's class at the very beginning. And I, as we mentioned, I spoke at conferences and stuff. I didn't really have time to to upgrade my knowledge, but I pick my tool depending on the project. So as I was saying in my talk, I thought I was going to get away with just raw graphs or Flourish and just download the chart as SVG and play around with it, and just didn't work for me. So I had to go to D3 and try and make it in it. So I think it will depend on the kind of work you're trying to do. And if you're like me and you try to do a bit of everything, which is, I'm not sure I advise on that, but if you're like me, then it's good to know the basics of everything so that you can Google the rest depending on the project. Like for instance, for this one, I knew the basics of D3, but I didn't know the exact functions and algorithms that are needed for circle packing. So this is the part that I looked up and I iterated on it for a few hours and then ended up with some sort of result. So that was a very long answer to Maxime's question. I hope it helps, and I would be curious to hear what you, Tyler, and everyone else think about this.
Yeah, I'll throw in my experience. I'm more in the kind of specialized software domain. So I actually, my introduction to data visualization was D3. And then I found out about everything else. So D3 is probably one of the harder tools to learn. I was lucky in that it was part of my job, so I had to learn it. And I had the time that I needed, but it's not necessarily easy for everyone to do that. But from that, I would say by learning the hardest tool, or one of them, it made it a lot easier to learn the other ones. So that is also a plus. Of course, I also work with software a lot, so it made it easier to learn other software libraries. But yeah, in the larger scheme, though, I would say, I mean, your experience kind of is the case in point. The tool is less important. As long as the tool is not preventing you from doing what you want to do. It's more about really what you just talked about, which is, the process itself and making sure that you're designing with a purpose and kind of following something that gives the result that you're really looking for. So to encourage everyone, learn the tools when you can, but if you don't have the time or whatever you need to do it, then, focus on the craft. Anyway, anyone else wants to say anything, by all means.
Just had a quick note on that. If you're starting out and you're a beginner, I really admire you, Tyler. I would not suggest someone start with D3 for the reason that when you learn a tool that sort of makes the entire graph for yourself, it's easier to comprehend it at first. So you will have the entire bar chart. And when you code in D3, you have to decompose all of it. So you have to draw each bar, each line, each circle, each axis and everything. So if you're a beginner, you're both learning data visualization and D3 at the same time. It can be a little scary, unless that's what you want to do. But that's not how I did it. And I was happy that I already knew about data visualization when I started to do stuff in D3GS.
Yeah. Any suggestions for materials specifically related to working with end users?
I'm not exactly sure if I understand the question. So as in working with the audience, I guess I don't have specific names, but I would say that I would turn to UX research as a research because it's a field close to data visualization, and that's where we borrowed all of our ideas from, I would say, because they've been doing it for a very long time.
Yeah, and I would recommend anything on user experience research. That would give you a lot of insight into how to kind of approach those conversations with users and kind of understand their perspective. All right. I think that's all the questions in good time. So thank you so much, Evelina, for joining. If you need to leave, feel free to leave. If you want to stick around, Ben is going to be speaking, and this is going to be a good one too. All right. So, sorry, a little zoom overhead here. Okay, so next up we have Benjamin Maskel. So Ben is a data science and strategy consultant for companies producing public sector analytic products. So he worked previously with the New York City Mayor's Office. He worked with Michael Bloomberg and Bill de Blasio, presumably not at the same time, because they were mayors at different times. Sorry, I used to live in New York, so maybe that's a New Yorker joke. But he used to work with them to evaluate and improve public policies and initiatives. I'm sure he could tell you a little bit more about that, but he's coming from New York, I believe, in the United States. So Ben, if you are ready, you take it.
Thank you, Tyler. And Evelina, that was a really, really good presentation. Before I jump into my own slides, I just want to say I spent a lot of time last year interviewing and hiring data viz designers. And if I ever saw kind of the breakdown that you just gave, I would hire you on the spot, although I'm sure I couldn't afford you. I just want to mention a couple of things like that you mentioned that I thought were really important. I mean, the audience being key, that's so important. I will talk a little bit about how I was tasked with designing a data viz for an audience I didn't know about. We were trying to kind of generate interest in a particular product we were building, but we didn't have an audience in mind. And doing that was nearly impossible. So the audience is so key. Your organization of the data viz process was really impressive. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but what I kind of came to eventually was that the questions people were asking me were kind of the how we structured the data viz to answer those questions specifically. Hand sketching, yeah, I did a lot of that, and that works great. So I really like the fact that you took pictures of your hand sketches. But anyway, I just thought that was a great presentation, and let me get into mine. What I will talk about is more of a kind of the application side of thing, like how to apply data viz in a business sense, kind of a product market fit, if you will. And the market I will be talking about is US government, public sector. And how I've worked within government and from outside of government to build data products for government to help them make better decisions. And I come at it, as Tyler said, from more of the modeling analysis side of things. So data viz is something I've really been exposed to more in the past year and kind of realized just how pivotal it is. Especially when it comes to any sort of descriptive analyses, which I will talk more about. And yeah, I love to get your feedback as I go. So feel free to leave comments or even interrupt me, because I always prefer conversations to just kind of an endless monologue. But basically my thesis is, and has been all along, that the promise of data science has remained unfulfilled for the US government. So we see all these companies these days in Silicon Valley that have a business model that is entirely data driven, and they've realized those gains. Now, it's not a perfect analog. You can't say that the US government is able to build data businesses like the private sector does. But to the degree that they're using data now, that can be improved, and the decision-making can also be improved. And that has always been kind of my mission, if you will. So let me tell you just a really brief story, and then I'll get into how data viz was the eventual core product of the company I was working for. So I started out, as Tyler mentioned, in the Bloomberg administration, and it was pretty amazing because it was actually a data-driven administration. In God we trust, everyone else bring data. That was kind of his famous quote. And in practice, that's actually how it worked. There's a great book I'm reading right now called No Filter by Sarah Fryer. And it's about how Facebook makes decisions. And basically it's hypothesis testing, it's A/B testing. Any decision has to be supported by data, and the data actually makes the decision in most cases. It's not based on subjectivity. So Mayor Bloomberg's office did kind of honor that fact. And I also put up this this book called Weapons of Math Destruction. And I was working closely with Kathy O'Neill at the time in Bloomberg's office, which is another great book about the dangers of algorithmic decision making, especially in the quantitative hedge fund area. So I'd highly recommend that. But that is just to kind of point out that like a lot of really prominent data scientists were flocking to the Bloomberg administration, and it was actually an exciting time. So under de Blasio, data kind of slipped to the back. I was responsible for evaluating a $850 million mental health initiative called the Thrive Initiative. And the fact that I was responsible for it should really tell you everything you need to know. I was like 4 years out of college. I had a team of 2. And I'm sure Tyler knows this, but the New York City public school system is the largest public school system in the US. It has 1.1 million children in it, and 20,000 staff. So this was an enormous network to evaluate. And most of my time was spent simply building the data collection infrastructure that was needed to rigorously evaluate it. And that meant building web applications, standardizing how services were classified so we could actually compare across schools. And the initiative was widely panned, as you can see from this quote from the New York Post. They were simply, it wasn't even a matter of evaluating the efficacy of the program. They couldn't even report out what they were doing effectively. And that would obviously be, greatly benefited by data viz, by very simple dashboards. But that was never a priority, and obviously wouldn't happen. I also spent time optimizing homeless shelter entry rates. So there were certain shelters that were homeless shelters.
Sorry, Ben. Oh, your audio cut out there for a minute.
Oh, sorry, am I back? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
I don't know when I lost you, but I spent some time evaluating homelessness and optimizing shelter entry rates. And I point that out because our conclusion was that permanent subsidies for homeless people actually kept them out of shelters. And this was unpopular politically, so the analysis was discarded. And that was one of the reasons why you face a lot of resistance in the public sector to data science, to analytics. So yeah, just a good segue. What went wrong? The culture of the public sector is very resistant to any sort of technological change. I did a lot of business development for a data science startup last year, and we were selling products to the public sector, which I'll get into in a second. And what I noticed was there's a lot of tech anxiety. You start talking about data, you start talking about web apps, you start talking about networks and optimization, and you encounter a lot of defensiveness, anxiety, and effective tech communicators are able to identify this and work past it. Not to say that's easy, but I think that that technological communication is just so vital. I listed a few other things here. There's really no incentive to adopt technology for most government workers. There's a general fear of replacement, which might explain anxiety. As I mentioned before, it's not always politically expedient to use data. And not everyone can be an analyst. I talk about this a little bit later, but I think I've worked for private sector companies and public sector companies who build the data warehouse They then invest a tremendous amount of money in Tableau or Power BI to give everyone the ability to pull descriptive analytics on their computer. And that doesn't seem to be working, right? No, like I would say, just kind of making this number up, but like 80% of people have no interest in this and really have no idea how to use this. And that might be being charitable. So what I came to at the very end of my time in government was that storytelling with data was the answer, right? We can't just send out tables. We can't just send out some sort of quantitative reporting. We would need to tell stories. We would need to make the data come to life, fit into a narrative that would then allow people to create memories about it, to start imagining. These are all the kind of cognitive processes that we wanted to get at with storytelling, with visualization. So I left government and I kind of came away with this idea that what if government outsourced the data science function? It made sense to me because government had no ability to pay people, data science, viz people, the way they were being paid in the open market. So we needed to find a way to create a company that could fulfill this function, acquire top talent, and improve decision making in the public sector. So that was the insight that I came away with. And enter community data platforms, which the talk is titled after, public data platforms. So the idea was to essentially fulfill that data science function for towns and cities in the US. And I realized as soon as I put this presentation together that I really am speaking only from a US lens. I would love to hear about the Swedish government's integration with any kind of tech. I would love to hear about that. I don't know anything about that. So our kind of animating why was you can't serve a community if you don't understand them. You can't create policies and you can't actually address the most pressing issues if you don't understand who lives in your community, what they do, how they walk around your community, how the businesses are functioning, energy. All these issues are directly related to understanding the community that you serve. And we had two kind of core products. And the first was data assets. We wanted to aggregate, clean, join data on a community and make that data a resource that could be reused over time. And we also offered analytics. We wanted to build methodologies that were scalable across many different communities. That was the only way we could survive as a company. An example of methodology is affordable housing. So how do we map every affordable housing unit in your community? How do we predict the rental costs for that unit? How do we predict the sale price for that unit? So that's an example of a methodology. I didn't really want to focus so much on the analytics and more on the viz, but I will just say one of the reasons that idea was not successful was simply because the local data sets are so messy, so much noise, so hard to clean. That became 90% of the work, simply cleaning local data sets. So I think the evolution of this idea is to pick a data set that is nationally relevant somehow and then build a product around it. But I will move along from that. So just to give you a sense of what kind of data we were working with, we were using commercial data sets, Uber Media, mobility data, which was aggregated cell phone pings, which has tons of applications. If there's one data source that I'm most excited about, it is mobility data. As you can see, alternative data sets that you purchase, public data sets that are just available, and then we called it hyper-local data sets, which were like companies that were specific to the community we were working in, and then they would send us like a spreadsheet, and we would try to integrate them into our systems. So who bought that? Who was interested in this? Community organizations, large enterprises, and consultants were our three big buckets. consultants who are constantly being hired to do analysis for that particular community needed data. And again, a lot of their time was spent collecting and cleaning data. So we wanted to expedite that process and get them to work faster. And then large enterprises, again, would probably eventually foot the bill for this sort of thing. And then there'd be some sort of revenue sharing mechanism that would allow community organizations to access these analytics for free. But again, this is the business model, so less of the focus of my talk. So anyway, we kind of identified 3 major waves of public sector perspectives towards data. The first wave was transparency, like let's just make it available. Then you know, people will be able to use it, people will be able to make better decisions, etc. The second was really, let's aggregate everything in a single place, like a repository. And then the third was, let's train everyone to be able to access those aggregated sources of information. And like I said before, that's where we saw the problem of everybody asking everybody to be an analyst, which doesn't work out so well, at least in my experience. And our approach started with the pressing question, and that's why Evelina, I pointed out that your talk resonated so much with me, because that was the organizing framework for our visualization development process. And you can see the last bullet there was beautiful and compelling visualizations. This is how we were going to reach communities. This is how we were going to show them the value of data and help them transition to data-informed decision-making. And you can see our little clever quote down there. Community leaders don't need a background in data science. They need a team of data scientists in the background. So that was our animating philosophy. And these are the types of visualizations we developed. This was for a town in Massachusetts, and we were trying to show the differences in population between 2017 and 2018. And we used machine learning techniques to predict daily population levels based on those hyperlocal data sets I showed you before, such as ferry, number of people taking the ferry to and from that town, or number of people flying in and out of that town. So that was the analytics side of things, but this was kind of the end product for this particular pressing question. And our goal for the Viz was always to form some sort of component library where we could say, this is kind of the buffet of options. We would go to a community and offer them this buffet of options. Which Viz speaks to you the most, you know, depending on your purpose. What's your intention with this visualization? Is it for public awareness? Is it to dive deep into a particular question, etc.? So we would have different offerings depending on their purpose. We started with an investment in Tableau. And as I was saying in the breakout group earlier, that proved to be underwhelming. Tableau offers very little ability to template what you're doing. So basically every time you develop a Viz in Tableau, you kind of have to tear it down and start over again. There's no way even to lock fonts or kind of basic chart design so that you can start at least 30% of the way done every time. There's no way to do that. So we shifted to D3. We were designing everything with JavaScript. We were designing web applications and things of that nature. So we shifted to D3, but it is very hard to find people who are competent with D3 and who also have an advanced design eye, or really any kind of data visualization software, at least in our experience. And that's why, Evelina, your presentation was, I think, so effective. But this was, I'm just going to show you several Viz that corresponded to different methodologies we were pushing out. So this methodology was population, which was one of the most popular ones. And just to give you a sense of why the ROI was attractive for a product like this. So for instance, the town we were working with was reporting to the US Census that they had about 16,000 residents, year-round residents, adult residents. And the state and federal dollars that each community is allotted is based on those census reportings. What we found was that population was more like $20,000, which is a big revenue jump. And our methodology was upheld by the census, and those dollars were allotted based on the updated number of 20,000. So there was a clear ROI based on this methodology, which, I think it may be a truism, it may be self-explanatory, but you always have to tie these viz directly to an ROI to make them sticky. And I'll talk more about that in a second, about the stickiness of descriptive analytics and data viz. This was actually the housing application we built to analyze housing stock on Nantucket Island. Basically a web application, JavaScript built. You can filter based on what price points you're looking at and other features such as year-rounders and anything else. So, and this is obviously a screenshot, so I can't do anything with it, but you can zoom in and select individual housing units and see their modeled housing price and things of that nature. So again, just understanding the community so it can be better served. We developed a series of COVID dashboards trying to tie community health metrics to economic health and financial health, presenting this, trying to pull these previously siloed data sources together so we could show the interaction between them. And again, I mean, very simple design. We really wanted to make it just as intuitive as possible and kind of direct the eye to what was most important. Evelina, when you were saying that you did everything in black and white, and then you decided which of the important elements to highlight, I thought that was brilliant. When I was interviewing data viz designers, one of my favorite questions was, tell me a story about a complex subject. And I don't care what subject it is, just tell me a story. And what that showed me, or what that gave me a window in, was how they were thinking. Did they present things at the macro level, and did they move down to the micro? And like, if you can explain things like that, you're thinking about things like that, and you will create visualizations like that. And at least that was my perspective. If you start at the macro level, people will understand things better. And that was always my intention with Viz. I just threw this one in here because it's mobility data, and I'm kind of obsessed with mobility data right now. Again, this is just a screenshot I wish I could show you. So you can select the industry here at the top, and you can see the changes in mobility, which is simply people walking around in front of businesses. So especially in COVID, you could really assess the economic damage due to a decline in foot traffic that resulted from the pandemic. So this was showing it by industry, and we were comparing foot traffic to a baseline. Demographics. So this was one we made with Tableau, and I just think is crazy to look at. And kind of, I just throw this in here just because I don't like Tableau. But demographics are like the most important thing. You know, this data was we bought it from a provider called Analytics IQ, and it's all modeled, but it's very good. It promises 95% coverage of the adult population in a community, so you get really a wide breadth of coverage. We also did economic development work, workforce analysis, predicting which industries were growing, which industries were fading. Interesting stuff. It's a pretty high growth area, economic development. And then traffic congestion, transportation planning. That was a big one. We did this big analysis for Indianapolis in the US about rotaries or roundabouts, how they function versus stoplights. And this was an outgrowth of that work. So I just wanted to give you a flavor for some of the viz we've been building. So it kind of brings me to the end. I mean, was this effort successful? I mean, I think my answer is to be decided, but at this moment, no. And my feeling is that our business model is based on descriptive analytics. So you're relying again on asking government workers to be analysts. Even if we answer their most pressing questions, whether it be about economic development, about housing, about COVID, we give them the right information. We present it in a way that, we're trying to tell a story, we're trying to make it compelling, we know our audience. We're still asking them to fundamentally reorient their paradigm and start making decisions based on data. So that's what I mean by culture being kind of the biggest impediment to data-driven decision-making uptake. So what my takeaway really is that there is demand for outsourced data science work, but the product itself might have to evolve past simple descriptive analytics. They're not sticky, and you face a lot of skepticism. I'm actually working with a startup now that is using prescriptive analytics, in that they're pushing nudges out through their CRM, their customer relations management system, or their learning management system. And they're trying to accomplish an objective that has a metric tied to it. And when I say prescriptive, the action is being taken. It's not asking the person to make the decision or to kind of review the descriptive analytics and then make a decision. That decision is automated, and you can measure its success based on a clearly defined metric. So that's where I see the value proposition for data science companies going. Prescriptive, to some degree, predictive analytics are valuable, but again, I think depending on what the product is, depending on how you deploy it, you're still asking government workers to make decisions. So it might be a matter of just waiting until the next generation rolls around and that kind of data-driven decision-making is already enmeshed in their paradigm. I'm not sure that will happen or not. I don't think that's inevitable. But with the current generation, I'm not so sure just simply reporting out descriptive analytics will be successful. So I already talked a little bit about this, but my next step really is to start looking at prescriptive data science business models, moving away from just simply descriptive. And there's also some amazing venture capital firms that are funding commercially viable startups that the goal of the requirements tied to the capital that they're given requires them to integrate with government systems and also be commercially viable. So you're creating products that work in both sectors. So that's another exciting opportunity. Anyway, that is my talk. I put my email there if any of you want to talk some more. I think this stuff is fascinating, and I'd love to get your take, because I really do think visualization is kind of the most exciting field in data science. I mean, data science is such a buzzword these days. I think data engineers clearly have a role. I think data scientists, like, that is a little ambiguous what that means. Are they statisticians? Are they machine learning experts? Computer science wants to call them machine learning experts and not data scientists. But data viz is the clear third pillar of that triumvirate. So anyway, thank you for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Yes, thanks, Ben. This is really good. It gave us some great kind of insight into a domain that we might not otherwise be looking at even. But it's also interesting to see how data viz has really penetrated. It's kind of everywhere. Places that I never would have thought to look. Maybe, coming from America, I have like a pessimistic view of the government's use of technology. So that's a different world. But you have a few questions here. So one, what were the challenges in transitioning to JavaScript-based apps from Tableau? Which parts have proven to be more complex than you thought? Planning a similar transition right now. It's from Nina.
Nina, yeah, I'd love to answer that question with more technical specificity. I was product managing a very talented D3 designer, and I was familiar with the output of D3 and he was obviously familiar with the actual technical, the technical need for D3. So we were aligned in that, so we lobbied for the company to pick up D3 over Tableau. But the specific challenges, I mean, he would have to answer that in more depth. I mean, as far as advantages go, as I was speaking before about the component library and being able to assemble all the things we built in D3, host them somewhere, and then be able to send that URL to somebody and say, look, this is all we have to offer. You know, which one of these components really speaks to you? And that was a huge benefit to us. And it also just shaved so much time off of our development, because we could take something and adapt it for something else, some other project, which Tableau was completely incapable of doing. So I would love to I guess one major challenge was our founders were not, I would say, technically inclined. So it was much easier to share Tableau with them and get feedback, a Tableau workbook with them to get feedback, than a JavaScript application. But as far as the technical details, I would have to bring on my colleague for that one.
I'm curious, you mentioned there's like, you said you feel like you basically have to wait for the next generation of government workers in order for them to actually embrace, you know, kind of the value of data. What do you think is the biggest impediment? And I ask because in data viz, in like the wider community, people talk a lot about kind of creating a data culture, or even creating a data viz culture specifically, and you know, how to kind of promote that. I'm curious what you see as major roadblocks, and also if you have any thoughts on how that could be promoted.
Yeah, it's a really, really tough one. I've done so many presentations at this point. So like walking into a room full of government workers and showing them what we've built. And the most common thing for them to do is to find like the smallest flaw and be like, it's all wrong. Like, I'm not paying attention to this anymore. Like, I'm done. And it's just like, okay, like, you might have identified something in your worldview that has been proved wrong by the data. Like people's natural inclination is to be like, I know it, that must be wrong. And instead, it's like, no, the value of data might be the largest value of data might be to challenge those kind of subjective intuitions. And people are very resistant to that. I think there's just I have a psychology background before data science, so I apologize if this is like a psychological analysis, but I feel like there's such something so intuitive to resisting technology, and that's what I mean by tech anxiety. It's like learning to speak through that anxiety is, I think, the biggest challenge for data professionals. I just think culture is so important. And say what you will and think what you will about Mark Zuckerberg, but he got that like immediately. Like if you go to the Facebook campus, you feel like you're in church, like a data church. And I don't know how to better describe it, but like everything all over the walls are these slogans about how data is the way to go. I'm sure you've all read this, but Yuval Noah Harari wrote a book, I think it was in Homo Deus, and he talks about dataism as becoming literally a substitute or analog for religion. That might be too far, like that might be too extreme, but I really think it's culture and trying to figure out a way to change the culture. And unfortunately, the leadership of government at the moment got to where they are through their loyalty to an old culture. So it's really hard to be like, forget that culture. That doesn't matter, or parts of it are good, parts of it aren't. So I don't know if that was helpful or not, but I guess my answer is it's very deep seated.
That is interesting. Yeah, I'm tempted to kind of dig into the psychology component more, but I think for everyone else's sake, maybe I won't. By the way, Ben and I are friends. We've known each other for a long time, so we get into these conversations sometimes. But a follow-up to my last question, Evelina asks if you have any tips on how to improve, or thoughts on how to improve data literacy just in general.
Yeah, I think data visualization is how to do it. I mean, I think you can show somebody a table and they will literally shut off. And if you show them a very simple visualization of that table, they will start interpreting it and learning it. I don't think that shocks anyone, but I think there's something really powerful there. It's like, how do we visually, like I so much of what we learn is visual. And I think for some people, numbers just don't, there's nothing visual about numbers. So I think just bridging the gap there is essential. And the other thing I'll say is jargon is not your friend. Like jargon in a technical environment where you're working with an engineering team, it's a time saver. It's important. But anytime you're dealing with somebody who doesn't have that data literacy, jargon is the fastest way to make them sink back into the old culture. So that's why I literally, when I'm talking to somebody, I will literally use the simplest possible words I can find. Richard Feynman, who's this really popular quantum physicist in the US, he says, if you can't explain something at a 5th grade level, you don't understand it well enough. You need to go back to the source material and learn it better. So that's kind of my animating principle. It's like, if I can't explain something at a 5th grade level, I'm going to lose you. And I don't think that's a indictment of people's intellect. I just think we have to understand the psychology of the culture that we're talking to.
And to your point, I think there's a component, you're talking kind of, loyalty to an old culture. There's maybe a little fear of that being replaced by this new thing that they don't really understand at the moment. And that just leads to like, well, I don't want to understand it because I don't want it to be near me. Yeah, perhaps that's a component as well. But anyway, do we have any more questions? Or if anyone has an experience of their own they want to share about working with, Swedish or any country really, technology and data, if they have anything they want to relate on, go ahead. I guess not. Okay, well, thank you, Ben. That was super interesting, and I really appreciate the insight. All right, so now that is the end of the talks. If you feel free to leave anytime, but if you want to stick around, we're going to do a little show and tell like we did last time. And then that, whoever wants to go can just take it away.
Wow. I always show stuff, so I'm not sure if I should show anything right now.
I have nothing. I'm busy. I'm going on parent leave in a month, so I'm just focused on that now.
All right, I can show you a little bit about a tool that I use a little bit to do prototypes for work. So I work at a newspaper, and sometimes you need to do some analysis of data, and you need to explain what you've been doing. So I'll show you what I worked on what the end result was. Let's see, what do we see? Do we see my screen with something called observable?
Looks good.
Looks good, right? So this is a thing that I made for a visualization at the newspaper, where we're gonna, where we had this idea that we wanted to show all the dead of the COVID, because it was part of an article series where we showed that we showed the people remembering their deceased loved ones. So we had data from the ministry. Well, not like, well, I'm not sure what it's called, right? It would be the CDC in the US and the Folkhälsomyndigheten in Sweden. They keep the statistics on COVID. So what we did here was actually wanted to see if we can do something where we could visualize one thing, one person as one thing, so we can get to see the full amount of how many died, because the numbers are just a little bit too little. When you see a number like 10,000 or a million or 50,000 or whatever, you just don't understand that very well. So we wanted to see what we could do. We didn't have that much data though. We had age ranges on when people died. So I use this tool where you can combine both visualizations and text, so that you can share your results, your analysis with people online. It's called Observable. It's pretty nice. I used photographs. I actually used Vega, which is really easy way to do visualizations. Let's see if we can just expand this thing here, and you will see how I did. It's a small schema that you use where you define what the y-axis and the x-axis means, and then you get the data, right? And I just defined the data up here, and I'm not going to show that because that's pretty big, I think. No, that's just the data ranges. So what we wanted to do with this data was all we had. So I looked at the distribution, and then I tried to see if I could do a simulation of all the people, how long they actually would have lived if they hadn't gotten COVID. Because a lot of people that die in COVID in Sweden were maybe 80 years plus, and everyone says, a lot of people said, well, I mean, they would have died that year anyway, or in a couple of years. So I looked at tried to simulate based on what's called life death chart table, where you can see what the chances is that someone at a certain age would die. So if they lived 1 year, say they were 78, they maybe had a 10% chance of dying, or risk, let's call it a risk instead of a chance. And I simulated them and see if they could live, how long they would live. So I got some stuff out of it. And what we have here is I looked at the number of years they would have lost based on the age when they had at the time. So a lot of people actually would, even if you're pretty old, you could still lose, as you can see, up to 5-10 years, even if you're 100, based on the statistics. Of course, there's a lot of assumptions going on here, because most of the people who died actually have multiple prior conditions. So heart disease, they might be obese, they might have diabetes, those people who actually died. But anyway, what I used this just to do a quick analysis. This took a couple of hours to do. Did some write-up on it, and said that all the people at that time would have lost a total of these many years, which is roughly 9 years per person, which is, I think at least, it's quite shocking when you think about it. Because even though people are old when they die, as you can see, the age when they die, there's actually a lot of 40 years and youngers as well. So even your assumption that it's only old people that die, it doesn't really matter, because there are 9 years per person that you died that you could have had with that person, all the loved ones that are left. So I looked into how we could visualize this, and I tried to get this metaphor when you go to church and you can light a candle as a remembrance for someone. And I wanted to make a big row of candles where you could see that. So this is a quick concept that I made in D3, also that embeddable here, right, in this observable thing, where I put the number of lost years to be the height of the candle. And then I just put out numbers of the age here just to see what happened, how old they were when they died. So as you already can see, there's a lot of candles here. And I think I limited this to 500 here in the code just to see. Otherwise, it took forever to render, which we will see led to some design choices, which I'm not really happy with. So, and then there's the D3 code, right? So I will just show you where, yeah, let's go see actually the result. So this would be the result of what we did then, after adding some design on this thing. So you can see the number of people on one row are 14, and it's dependent on the width of the screen. So it's responsive as well. And if you just scroll, at least you get a feel for it, that there's a lot of people who actually died here. And I felt this was pretty effective. We wanted to have more because we only had the age and the sex of the gender of the person. But it just continues forever, it feels. And it does, right? It's 10,000 people. And here you have, we also had, there's not that many people who are under 10. I think in Sweden was 2 children who died, and then under 40. So we actually did a little bit of anonymization. Also, we changed that the length wouldn't be on the number of years you lost, but like an inverse of how old you were. So we took the oldest person, and then they 109 7 years, I think, and then we put that at a full candlelight and length, and then made it shorter because we did some UX tests, and not a lot of people actually understood what lost years meant and how we calculated. It was a bit too abstract. Now, this was part of an article series where we put up people who tell them about the loved ones that died. And then that would be the last page here, right, which we linked into the visualization. Now, if you ever have done web development, you realize that having 10,000 DOM elements times everything here, a little bit SVG and stuff, turns out to be maybe close to 300,000 elements. So you can't show them immediately, all of them, because that would just make the page render forever. So we put the visualization inside an iframe instead. This also was because if you want to try to load this data on a train as well and render it on your phone, which a lot of people do, and look at the phone, then this wouldn't actually work either. That would be even slower. It took maybe a minute to load this whole thing otherwise. So what I just do now is we show, not sure how many, 10 rows, and then we just switch them out with new data. So we destroy the old values, the old rows when they're out of sight, and then show, create new ones. That way the page only it's actually faster to create and destroy things than to render them all in memory at one time. And also you get the bonus of going down to the bottom of the page and see our chapter grid. You can navigate all the way. So this works kinda-ish, but it's more being in a iframe loses the sense of the height and how far you have to go to get to the bottom of the list to understand that, to get the physical almost perception of how many people have died and how many candles there are. I wouldn't actually mind the people not reaching the end. They would just see this is an endless list of all the people who died. Right, and that's my showcase. if you have any questions, then just feel free to ask them. Good. I'll just stop sharing that one. And that's what I had to share right now. Does anyone else have anything they want to share or just talk about in general?
Nina, what about your street visualization that you showed last time? Have you worked further on it?
You caught me. Yeah, I am still working on, but I'm in the data collection part. So I realized that it was a quite long project, and I branched out a small part of it. So I only visualized the streets that were named after women. And I wasn't planning to show it, but since you asked, maybe I can. I also wanted to make it like in a normal web interface, but I wanted to do it quick, so I ended up doing it in Tableau. So here is the my design. I wanted to. Oh, it's in Russian. Sorry, I think there was maybe someone who understands, but not everyone. So it is for my hometown, and it says like how many of the streets are named after women. I thought it was quite interesting. There were so few, and since no one is really talking about it in the media, I thought it was interesting thing to highlight. So showing it on the map and saying that this is only 2% of the total, showing the 52% for the men and 46 for everyone, all the other names. And then I made some like data portraits inspired by a lot of other work that is done in a similar way. So showing what they have done, encoding it with color, like what type of person they are. And if they were a hero of the Soviet Union, they have a star next to them. And another aspect that I thought was interesting is encoding the number of streets named after the same person in Russia as a bar next to them. In that way, we can see who are the local people here, who have a relationship to the local history, and who are like Lenin's wife is like a standard street name in the country. So this turned out to be rather static. I have it published in Tableau as well, but I don't really like how it looks on mobile. And yeah, I published it as a static picture. So this is the progress right now.
I think it looks really cool. It looks really nice.
Yeah.
It's so clean. It's good.
Yeah. I like the background, like you have like kind of a faded background. It just, everything lends like a very nice aesthetic.
Thanks. I had many iterations, and also as Evelina suggested, the mood board with similar work. So I think I can improve on my design process going forward. No.
Oh, not much. Well, but are you? But you're saying that you have issues getting it to mobile. How do you think you're going to solve that? Because I don't think Tableau is very good at mobile versions.
Yeah, especially not the maps. Yeah, I don't have a solution right now. So.
Because it always feels like that's when you have this great idea and you try it out and it looks really good, and then you discuss it with your friends and it's on desktop, and then suddenly you realize that, oh, like 80% will view this thing on their mobile device, and then what do you cut away, and suddenly there's nothing left of your nice visualization.
Yeah.
That's at least
It's,
how
yeah. It's probably a separate big discussion, but I also realize that whatever you post on Twitter or in any other social media, most of it is getting opened from the mobile device.
Yeah.
And we usually disregard that.
Yeah, and it's also hard, right? I liked the way that you made it. It almost felt like it was more like a book almost. You would flip through 2 pages of a pamphlet. Might have just been because it was 2 views in Figma, right? But it felt like this would be one big page that had been folded and opened up. But that doesn't lend well to like the interactive patterns on the web either. So it's like, oh God, so hard. And it's the problem, right? We design on a desktop or a laptop, not on a phone. They should go away.
Yeah, but maybe we can reserve this for like another meetup topic or some discussion. I think it would be interesting to see how other people solve this problem.
All right.
I think not that many of us left. Maybe we can wrap up. We have been already here for 2 hours.
Wow.
But interesting discussions, and thank you guys for presenting your talks. I think I'm gonna rewatch them and send some links to my colleagues, because a lot of good insights that are very practical.
Yeah, it was really cool. Thank you.
See you next time.
See you all, everyone. Bye.
Bye.